In this video, I am going to be showing a basic implementation of a CI/CD workflow. By the end of this video, you're going to understand how to actually package a Java application, and we're going to use Maven to package the application, and the pipeline is basically going to create a Docker image using the package. Once the Docker image is built, it's going to be pushed to the Docker hub, and then the pipeline will update a manifest file or a YAML file. This file is going to be used by the Argo CD application to deploy your service, meaning like the Java application that we want to deploy. Argo CD is going to deploy that in an EKS cluster basically. So that means we're going to have to build a lot of things. We're going to be building this pipeline in Jenkins. Of course, our code is going to be in GitHub, and we are going to need to install a lot of things on the Jenkins host, like for example Maven, Docker, and Git and whatnot, right? So we're going to install a lot of things on the Jenkins host. We're going to create like an EKS cluster using an EKSCTL or EKSCutl command, and we're going to deploy Argo CD service in Kubernetes. So if you are a beginner, in the DevOps world, this is going to be really interesting. You will learn a lot. Yeah. So what are we waiting for? Let's jump in. Okay. So I have some notes for this implementation. Okay. And I've tested this a couple of times. It works, but there is no guarantee that it will work in a live demo. So I'm going to do my best. If it fails anywhere in this, in this process, in this implementation, we'll troubleshoot and fix it, and that way you'll also get to see a bit of, troubleshooting. Like, you'll get to learn how to troubleshoot, right? The first thing I'm going to do is basically go to my AWS account. So this is my personal AWS account, and I'm going to be creating an EC2 instance, and this is going to be our Java host, right? So I'm going to name it, it can be named whatever, it doesn't matter. So I'm going to say just Jenkins node, and or I can call it my Jenkins node. Okay, and this is going to be an Ubuntu, this is going to be using Ubuntu image, and I'm going to choose this particular version of Ubuntu operating system, and this is fine. Okay, and it's 64-bit, and we need a slightly better machine. So I'm going to be using this T2 large, which has 2 cores and 8 gigs memory, and I'm going to be using one of my keys, right? So you need a key pair to actually log into your EC2 hosts, right? So I'm going to be using one of my pre-existing key pairs, and so I'm going to let it create a new security group which is going to be attached to my EC2, and we need to make changes to this security group, and I'll show you that. Okay, I'm going to be granting 25 gigs of storage, which is for the root volume, that's going to be in the machine. Okay, so that's pretty much it. Okay, so that's pretty much it. Okay, so I am actually going to launch this instance. So it's going to take a couple of minutes to come up, and in that meantime, since we have a lot of ground to cover, I am actually going to be switching to my nodes. Okay, the second thing, or the second big thing that we need, is to create like an EKS cluster, which is a Kubernetes cluster, and EKS is an AWS service, right? So, and they provide this, this EKS Cuttle or EKS CTL utility, using which you can basically, like, you can create resources on EKS resources, right? So and for this to work, you need to have this AWS CLI installed. Okay, and I have actually logged into my AWS account as a particular IAM user called Paul, right? And once you install this AWS CLI on your machine, like I have a Mac laptop, so I use the brew installer to install my AWS CLI, and and then I actually use the AWS configure command to basically provide my IAM user credentials. So these are some prerequisites. Okay, so if you don't know how to do these things, please let me know in the comments. I'll either try to make a video of my own, or I'll provide you links to other videos where they show you how to do these things. Okay, of course, like, you have to install the EKS Cuttle utility as well. So, and I use the brew commands to install that as well. So finally, I just need to just create like a cluster. So my cluster is going to be called CI/CD demo, and then I'm going to be using these instances, like, or instances of this type, and I just need one worker node. Okay, and it's going to be in the US East 1 region, and these are the zones that where the nodes are going to come up actually. Okay, so I'm going to just copy this and go to like a terminal. So this is my terminal, and I'm going to just run this command. Okay, and this is going to take, I would say, about 15 minutes. Okay, so I'm not going to bother this window. So let me just open another tab. Okay, and of course we want to see big fonts, so let's do that. So now let's see if this is up and running. So this is the EC2 instance that we are going to use as Jenkins host, right? So before we we actually go ahead and like log into this instance and then install all the required software for our CI/CD, I am actually going to modify the security group. Okay, so I'm going to check this box and then come to security tab and then go to the security groups, and then in here I'm going to actually modify the inbound rules. Okay, right now it only allows basically like logging, SSHing into this machine from any IP, right? So that is fine, but if we want to access the Jenkins portal, right, so then we need to access a different port, right? 8080. When Jenkins comes up, it will be accessible through 8080 by default. So I'm going to be very lenient and use this particular rule. Basically, I'm going to allow all traffic from all the IPs, basically allowing all the ports, right? And this is actually not supposed to be used in production, meaning like you don't want to use this kind of relaxed, lenient rule in production. So I don't want to actually deal with complexities of finding my IP and then and then opening only the ports that we need, you could do that. Especially on my laptop, I have a VPN installed, so the source IP keeps changing, so I don't want to deal with those issues. So I basically, right now for this demo, actually I'm going to make it easy for myself and allow all the traffic. Okay, I'm going to just save that. Okay, so that's good. Now let's go back to the instance. Now we are going to get into the instance and log in and install a bunch of things. Okay, so we still have the EKS curl command running, which is fine. And now let me log into the Jenkins host. Okay, so I'm going to use this SSH command and I will be using my key. I know the key pair that I selected is something different, but I don't want to reveal the path to my key pair, so this is what it is for now. In your case, you will be putting the actual path to your .pem file. If you're using putty, then you need to configure putty in a different way. So again, if you want all these like minute details, please let me know. Like, I'll be able to point you to resources which will make it clearer. So I'm going to use the SSH command to log into my Jenkins host. Okay, so we are logged in, and now I'm going to switch to root. So let's start installing all the required software. Okay, so I'm going to refer to my notes, and basically I'm going to be running all these apt commands, apt-get commands, right? These are native to Ubuntu operating system, right? So I'm going to be running these commands to install, first of all starting with Java, right? So I'm installing JDK 17. Okay, so the Java is installed. Let's just check the Java version. Okay, no, it's good actually. So basically we have installed OpenJDK version, Java version 17. Okay, now let's keep moving. So we want to install Jenkins next, so I'm going to be running these commands one by one. And these commands, of course, like I got it from other resources. You can actually go to the Jenkins documentation and find the same commands, but I'll share all these commands in my in the description. Like you'll have a GitHub Git repo link. Okay, so let's keep going. So I am actually gonna run this apt-get install Jenkins. Okay, Jenkins is installed. So let's check the status of Jenkins. So as you can see, Jenkins is now running, right, on this EC2 instance that we created. Now you can see that there's a alphanumeric string, and that's the initial admin password of Jenkins, so we can make note of it. So it's here in this log. Also you can, if you can go to this file and find the same thing. So I'm going to make a note of this password. We'll need it later. So the pipeline that we are going to build is going to retrieve or grab the software from GitHub, right? So we'll need git. Okay, so now also we'll need Docker, because we're going to be building Docker images. We'll be pushing the Docker image to Docker hub. So let's install Docker. Okay, so now we need to provide some permission. Basically, we're adding Jenkins, basically Jenkins user to the Docker group, right? That way Jenkins can run Docker commands, right? So we need to do that, and let's install this Maven or Maven. Okay, and of course we'll be doing a bunch of things on the Jenkins as well, like, you know, not the host, but we'll log into Jenkins and then we'll perform some plugin installations which are required. Now I'm actually going to be putting these environment variables in place. These are required for our Jenkins to invoke Maven, right? So because we are putting the Java home, Maven home, and we're adding all these things to the path, so that way actually when the Maven commands are invoked in the pipeline, you know, these are going to be useful, right? So let me go into, I'm going to put them in the Jenkins user. Okay, so we'll just switch to Jenkins and we'll go to bash r, yeah, so it's going to be .bash rc. okay, that's the file, and I'm going to be putting these commands in there. Okay, so I think that's good for now. Now okay, we'll now log into the Jenkins host. So the EKS cluster is still being created, so that's good. Now let's log into the Jenkins host. To log into the Jenkins host, so we're going to need this public IP. You can grab it from the console, and we're going to go to a browser and just put that IP and :8080. okay, so basically that's gonna bring up this Jenkins page, right? And then if you remember, we made note of this initial admin password. Okay, so let's go to my notes because we copied the password there. Let's take that password and put it in here and continue. Okay, now we can just click on this install suggested plugins. So sometimes you'll see this error, so don't be worried. So we just need to retry a couple of times, you know. Okay, see, I had to retry like a couple of times, and then the third time it's now working. Now it's going to install like a lot of things for us, which includes Git. This is the plugin, I believe. And okay, we need to create like an admin user. Okay, so I'm going to be creating a user called admin1, and then just type some password. Okay, and I'll just provide my details here. Okay, let's just continue. Okay, that's the Jenkins URL. Save and finish. So now we can start using the Jenkins UI. Now I'm gonna go into manage Jenkins and then go to the plugins option, and then I'm going to be installing mainly Docker pipeline plugin. Okay, so let's install that. So it's going to take a few seconds, so that's good. Now let's see if we have like a Maven integration plugin. These are the things that is going to help us later. Okay, again another few seconds. So all I'm doing is I'm going to available plugins, looking for that particular, like, I installed Docker and Maven, and we need to do one more thing, or maybe a couple of more things. So I went back to manage Jenkins and in here I can go to the tools. Okay, and then in here I'm going to do this. You see, add Maven. So I'm going to just give it a name, say Maven 3. And since we already installed Maven, we don't need to install it via Jenkins. Okay, so I'm just going to copy the home of Maven right here. So this is the Maven home and I'm going to copy it in here and then just save. Okay, all good. Now let's see if the EKS cluster is ready. Actually, the EKS cluster is now, it's ready. Actually, it's the command finished successfully, so that's good. But let's start building the pipeline. Okay, so let's go back to the dashboard and then we'll create a new item and let's call this my CI/CD pipeline. Of course, we're not going to do CD here, so we can just call it CI pipeline. Okay, let's be true to the actual nature of the pipeline. Okay, so now I'm going to click on pipeline here and then hit OK. Okay, so now here's the thing. So this is basically the page where you can actually start writing the code. You can actually build your pipeline step by step. Okay, so I'm going to be using a script, right? Because Jenkins uses this Groovy language, right? For building pipelines or for developing pipelines. So I already have some code to help us. So we're not going to just copy and paste everything and then just expect it to work. So I'm going to copy this code into my Sublime text, right? That's a text pad kind of thing. And of course I'm going to set the syntax to Groovy. Okay, now that's going to help us a little bit. Of course you can use Visual Studio Code or whatever. Okay, so now let's just do this one by one, right? So now that is the entire block, so I'm going to just delete all of them except this part. Okay, now this one, if you look, we are basically adding a stage to check out my code. Okay, So I have a couple of repositories which are important for our pipeline. So let me actually before we add this, I need to do one thing, okay, which is basically prepare the credentials or create the credentials in Jenkins. Okay, so in order to do that, we need to actually create like a SSH key pair, and that's because if you see, I'm using the git at github.com, right? So sometimes people use HTTPS and then basically HTTPS URL, and then they'll just provide username and password, right? So that's usually not the case like in a professional setting. So people use like this SSH URL mostly. So but in order to make it work, we need to create like an SSH key pair, and then you need to provide the public key on GitHub. Okay, so the way I'm going to do it is basically I have some commands to help me out. Okay, so now if you see this one, this is the SSH key gen command, and that's what is going to create the key pair. Okay, so now I'm still on the Jenkins host, so I'll switch to root because it's having like sudo -u Jenkins. Basically it's executing this command as SSH I mean like Jenkins user, right? So when I run this command, basically I'm just gonna hit the return key or enter key, and that actually saves the private key and public key pair in this directory. Okay, so now switching back to Jenkins, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy the contents of this file into my GitHub repository. Okay, so if I go here and I can, let me just open a new window, github.com, and I'm already logged in as my user, right? And then we need to go into settings over here, and then we need to go into SSH and GPG keys, and then in here I'm going to actually click on new SSH key, okay, and give it a name, right? Something, right? So let's say Jenkins host public SSH public key or something like that. Okay, and then I'm going to be copying the contents of this file. See, this is the public key, right? So I'm going to be going into this file, copying the contents of this file into here. I'll actually be back after saving that. So I'm done saving the SSH key here, or mainly the public key on GitHub, and we need to do one more thing. Okay, so there was another file, right? So basically there was a public key and then we have the private key. We need to take this private key and then put it in the Jenkins credentials, or save it in Jenkins credentials, and that way we can use that credential in the pipeline that we are creating. Okay, so I will be going to manage Jenkins, and in the credentials here, and then I will be going into the system credentials, and we're going to create global credentials, and let's add credentials over here. Okay, so and we're going to choose this SSH username with private key. Okay, and since I'm using a particular ID in my code, if you see, I'm using git SSH credentials, right? So that's what I'm going to be putting over here, and the username of my GitHub account is this, and I'm going to be entering the public key private key in here. So I clicked on this enter directly, add, and basically I'm going to be copying the contents of this file in here actually. Okay, I'll save it and I'll see you in a second. Okay, so now I have saved that credential, and now we're ready to create our first stage called checkout in our pipeline. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this code, and I'm going to go to the main dashboard page, go into our pipeline, click on configure, and then I'm going to just put that code in here, because this is, as I said, it's Groovy language. Okay, so I'm going to save here. So if I just build this pipeline now, let's see what happens, right? So I'm going to go, and so you'll see that basically it says whatever, no ed 25519 host key, whatever, right? What I'm going to do is I am actually going to, let's go to temp directory, and I'm just going to run this git clone command. Okay, and I'm going to be cloning this particular repository, and you see this is the thing that I was talking about. So it basically, it is looking for this key in the known host, and it's not there. So as soon as I say yes, right, because I want to keep connecting to this GitHub repo, now it's going to be added to the known host file. So we don't need this repo in here, so I'll just delete it. But by doing this, basically I have added my GitHub, or added the github.com IP to the known host file. Now run the pipeline again, and then this time it actually seems to be working. So this time it basically, it was able to retrieve the code from my repository. And how can you verify this? So if you go to this particular directory, right, workspace directory, and then the name of the pipeline is CI pipeline, right? So let's go here. This is the Jenkins host, right? And you can see that there are a couple of directories, right? And then you have basically these things, so basically it was able to clone all my repos in this directory. Okay, so now this is good, so we can move on to the next stage. So let me go back to my code, and I'm going to see, this is the rest of the code. Okay, now I'm going to include one more stage in my pipeline. Okay, so let's just add these stages one by one, right? So that's the way to actually build a pipeline, right? So you don't write all the code at once and then just throw it in your pipeline window, and then just expect it to work, right? So you build it one by one. Okay, so let's just include one more stage called build, and what this is going to do is go into my Spring API directory, right? So if we are in the workspace, and this is the pipeline directory, so it's going to go into my Spring API directory. So if you look at my Spring API directory, there's going to be my source code, and then there's going to be a Docker file, and there's going to be pom.xml. Basically this is my source code, and it's going to run the Maven package command. Okay, so that's the Maven clean package command, and this is going to produce the jar file that we will be using to build a Docker image. Okay, so let's copy this code and then go to the pipeline, configure, and then put it in here, save it. And if you are curious, you can go to my repo over here in the sample Java apps, and then you will see the same code, right? So now we have saved the code, which has 2 stages. So let's go ahead and build the pipeline again. So it seems to be going fine so far. So Maven, it's able to invoke the Maven command or Maven executable, which is a good sign. And then basically it created like the jar file that I was talking about, right? And then it created the jar file in the target directory. If you are if you have done any Java programming, this is pretty normal. So we have the jar file, so that's good. So we can move on to the next stage, and let's see the code. Okay, this is the stage where we basically build the Docker image, and then we are going to push the Docker image to the Docker hub. Okay, so and if you look closely, there is another secret which is called Docker secret. That's my arbitrary name, you can call it whatever, but basically this credential is going to be used by the pipeline to access my Docker account, my account on Docker hub, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to dashboard, manage Jenkins, credentials, and system global credentials. I'm going to add another credential, so it's going to be basically username with password. So I'm going to call it exactly this because that's what my pipeline code is calling it. And then I'm going to be using my Docker password or Docker credentials. So I think that's the right password. So okay, so we have the Docker credential. Now let's go to the code, include. So I'm going to be deleting this particular stage, which will come to later. So let me delete that. You got to make sure that we are we're removing the right section, right? Because you don't, if you remove an extra bracket, then that's going to basically there's going to be issues in saving in the pipeline or developing the pipeline, right? Because it's going to error out. So let me copy this code and then put it in the pipeline script. Okay, so we go in here and then we go down here. So we're going to copy the script in here, save it, so there are no errors. So if you have any syntax errors, it's not going to save properly. And then let's build it. So it's going to be interesting. console output. So so it failed. Okay, so what does it say? It says permission denied while connecting to Docker. Okay, so the reason why it's happening is, so we actually installed a bunch of things, right? So we installed Jenkins and then we install Docker, but then we haven't restarted Jenkins after installing all that software. Okay, the way you restart Jenkins is by being the root user, and then if you see here, I have like you can just like use systemctl commands to restart Jenkins. Okay, so I'm just gonna do this, and then just instead of start, I'm gonna call it restart. So we got the permission denied error, right? So let me explain, because I don't want to just rush through this quickly. So we got the permission denied error. So basically Jenkins is not able to invoke the Docker executable. Okay, so now let's see. So the Jenkins has restarted, so we can check the status again. So it's active, it's all fine. So now let's go back to the pipeline and try running it. So now it's going to ask for our username and password again because we restarted Jenkins. Okay, that's that. So let's build the pipeline now. Let's see what happens. So console output. So the way you check the log of any pipeline is going to console output. Okay, so now we can see that it is able to access Docker and it is doing a bunch of things. So if you go to my source code, right, the source code of the Java application, there is a Docker file. Now if you see my code, the pipeline code, this is basically the repo that I'm using, JM Bharatram Spring API, and then build number, right? So this is the Docker image name, right? And then this is the tag. Okay, but then if you look at my code, it is actually going into the Spring API directory, and if you remember, the Spring API directory was it was retrieved from these repos, right? Now we go into that directory and then we do a docker build -d, and then this is the Docker image, and then these are basically some Docker commands to push the Docker image to Docker Hub, right? So now basically when you do a dot, like you go to cd this directory and then docker build -t, this is the tag of the image that we're building, and then dot is basically the current directory where your Docker file is. So in the Spring API directory, the Docker file is here, so it's using this Docker image, it's using this Docker file to build that image. So, and it's basically like using like a OpenJDK 17 base image. It's using this directory, the /app directory, and it's just copying this jar file that we built earlier using the Maven command, and then copying the jar into this app directory. Finally, it's just starting the application using java jar command. Pretty simple, right? So quite straightforward. Okay, so this time it was able to push the image to my Docker Hub account. Okay, so let's check that. So I'm gonna go to hub.docker.com. So I'm going to go into this repo, and you can see a bunch of images. So this was pushed less than a minute ago. Okay, so these are from a couple of days ago, right? So when I was testing these things. So good thing is I have these images. So now let's go to the last stage in the pipeline. Okay, now this stage is going to update whatever image was built in the previous stage. It's going to update it in a particular deployment file. Okay, so the deployment file is in the manifest directory, but I think we have to make a small correction over here. So if you go to this, okay, let's go to the Jenkins user, and if we go to the workspace CI pipeline, so the manifest directory is here. So we need to correct the directory. Okay, and what it is going to do is, so if you look at my repo and then this particular file, right? So I go to Jenkins manifest directory, and then so the name of the file is not deployment.yaml, rather it is Spring API application.yaml. So I'm going to correct that as well. So it's going to be looking for this file, and I'll show you the contents of this file. Okay, so this file has two things. One is basically the deployment resource. Okay, so it's going to deploy this resource, and what is the resource? It's going to basically use like a whatever image, right? So in here it says 14. Maybe that was the last image that I used when in my testing, but what our pipeline is going to do is it's going to update this particular file to the image that it builds, and then of course we have the service object as well, which is basically for us to be able to access this particular application, right? So deployment is like a Kubernetes concept, right? So it's going to create this deployment in the Kubernetes cluster that we just built. So if you remember in the beginning of the lesson, we built like a EKS cluster. Okay, so we're going to make use of that. Okay, so now, so everything is good. So this is the directory, this is the application or the manifest of the application, and then we're going to push that change to GitHub. Okay, so now before we do this, we need to deploy the Argo CD application. So let's actually access the Kubernetes cluster that we just built. So I'm going to be going back to this command. Basically this is what we will use to update the kube config file. You know, that's where we're going to store the configuration of this Kubernetes cluster, and so it's going to update the kube config file. And if you look at that file right now, if you look at the cluster right now, there is nothing running. Okay, and this is where we're going to install this Argo CD as well. Okay, so to install Argo CD, okay, so I'm going to use a couple of manifests. So basically we're going to run these commands to install Argo CD, and so for that we need to create the namespace first. Argo CD namespace, and we will be running this command. So it's going to create all the resources it requires to install Argo CD. Okay, that's a lot of resources. So let's check the pods. Okay, you can see that basically the pods are still coming up, so you got to wait for that. Okay, now all the pods are running, so we're checking the Argo CD namespace, right? So let's see. Okay, I was waiting for the server, Argo CD server, to come online, so now that is ready as well. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to access the Argo CD application, and the way I'm going to do this is by using this port forward command. Let me show you what I mean. So we're going to go here to the localhost, okay, and then if you see localhost :8080, right, it's hitting this page, but if you go to, you know, it's complaining because it's not HTTPS, right? So it's still our lab, we're not using any encryption, that's why it's complaining, but you can still get to it. Okay, so now we're going to need to provide a password to log into Argo, and that password is going to be stored in a Kubernetes secret called Argo CD initial admin secret. Okay, so to retrieve the password, we run this command. Okay, now we can open another window. So let me run this command, and there you go. So this is the password, the initial admin password. Okay, so let's log in. Okay, perfect. Now we're going to create an application, and I'm going to call it CI/CD, or I can just call it Spring API demo or something like that. Okay, put it in the default project. I want it to sync automatically. I don't need to do anything else. I'm going to need to provide the path to the deployment file or the manifest file, which is in this repo. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make it easy for myself, because again here I don't want to use the SSH and things like that. I could still do it, but it's fine. Let's just use the HTTPS. Okay, and this is going to be the main branch. Okay, and the path to the file, so we shouldn't give the path to the file, rather the directory where the file is. So we're going to copy the path, so that's the path, and the cluster URL is this. Namespace, we can just keep it as default. Okay, I'm gonna just create the application. Now right away it goes into action, right? So it was able to retrieve the deployment file and then create the resources. So let's check that. So I'm going to make this bigger so you can see kubectl get pods. So you can see the application is already up and running. Now let's check the service that I talked about. Now that is also up and running. You see. Okay, now Argo CD is able to automatically deploy our application based on the manifest file. Let's go back to the pipeline. Remember that last stage that I was talking about, that we haven't added yet? So if you go back to my code, so this is the last stage, which is image update, right? So the last stage was able to build the image and push it to the Docker Hub, but this stage is basically going to update the Spring API application.yaml file, you know. So let's copy all this code into this guy. Okay, now paste. So all good. So let's go ahead and save this. Now you can see the last successful run was build number 7, and the image tag was also the same, if you actually recollect, right? So this was pushed 5 minutes ago. So basically that's what we are using as the tag number, right? So now let's actually do something. I'm gonna build this, and so let that run. Now this is the file, right? So you can see right now it's got some image number 14, which is from yesterday, right? So we just got actually updated to 8 because the pipeline finished, and then it uploaded a new image called 8 to, you know, with tag 8 to Docker Hub, and then you can see the pipeline completed, right? And then also you should see Argo CD in action. As soon as our repo got updated, which is just now, Argo CD goes into action. So if you refresh this application over here, you can see it's already coming up with some new pods, right, with the new image. You can see, right? So now the new images are deployed. So that is basically continuous delivery or continuous deployment, right? So if you see the pods, so now they just got deployed 20 seconds ago, and you can see these are new pods, right? So this is different from this. Now let me actually show you the application that got deployed, right? Because that's like a sample application that we used. So for that, I'm going to get this load balancer external IP, and then go here, and then since this is like an API, so I'm going to use this user API, and then ID equals 1. You see, now this is able to hit the application, right? And then it shows some data, right? So it's not, the data itself is not important, but we are able to access the application. All right, so that's actually quite a bit that we have covered in this demo. So if you like this video, my teaching style, or if you don't like it, let me know. I'll be reading all your comments and I'll be responding to them. Thank you so much for all your time. I worked really hard on this video, so feel free to share it, you know, and then that way others can also learn DevOps. Okay, thank you guys. Go DevOps. See you next time.